Welcome to my very scientific race laboratory. May the pure light of reason guide us. We'll begin by measuring the superior dimensions of the Caucasoid skull. "'Tis evident to every scientific inquirer that nature hath seen fit to divide the creature man into several distinct classes, whereof a manifest hierarchy subsists." Lord Foppington, what are you doing in my lab? I'm delineating the crania of the plurality of humankinds. Well, the 18th century called, they want their ideas back. Well, the anime convention called, they want their wig back. Foppington, get out of my lab, before I slice you on the slab. Nay, nay. The fucking people you have to talk to in this line of work. Where's my Pepsi? Part 1. Race and Biology. Because race is pseudoscience has often served as an alibi to genocide, slavery, eugenics, discrimination, imperialism, medical abuse, and torture, many people are understandably reluctant to broach the subject of biology and race. Unfortunately, this kind of reluctance can look like a kind of politically correct avoidance of the truth. So let's just do away with all the reluctance and begin by seeking out an answer to the question, is there any biological reality to race, following the evidence wherever it may lead?
Yea, verily.
How did you get there?
Apparently this hallway is just one long circuit.
Well, go away! Now, if we're being honest with ourselves, it's very difficult to approach a topic as politically loaded as race without bringing a lot of baggage to the table. But one way we might try to start from a more objective standpoint is to try a thought experiment proposed by the YouTuber Concordance, namely, to imagine that an alien species landed on Earth with our understanding of genetics, but without our knowledge of human social and political history. Would it occur to these alien scientists to divide human beings into the conventional racial categories of black, white, Asian, and so on? The answer to this question is a pretty definite no. Let's take a look at why. Geneticists measure human variation by comparing the frequency of genetic markers between different populations. It's pretty well known that around 85% of genetic variation is found within groups, meaning that any two individuals from different populations are not likely to be much more different than any two individuals from the same population. And only around 6 to 10% of total variation is found between continental groups, what might imprecisely be called races. Now, 6 to 10% is not zero, so you might think there is some justification for traditional race categories based on continental origin. However, for most of human history, there has been continuous gene flow between local populations, including across continental divides. So there are no distinct boundaries separating continental populations from each other, and the continental populations themselves are not homogeneous. This is evident when you look at, for instance, the distribution of Y chromosome haplogroups across the globe. Categories like white, black, and Asian are therefore extremely arbitrary ways of dividing up the genetic continuum. In fact, there is no purely genetic justification for using, say, 5 race categories as opposed to just 1, or 300, or 3 million. And because of global gene flow, there are no pure races no matter how many categories you choose, with the possible exception of some Pacific Islanders. This is especially true in countries with recent global immigration, like the US and Brazil, where mixed European, African, and Amerindian ancestry is the norm. These points are all made more eloquently and in much more detail in a 2-part video by Concordance, which I highly recommend and have linked to in the description. The upshot is that while geneticists and physical anthropologists can divide humans into populations based on ancestry, there is no scientific reason for those divisions to track traditional race categories. This is because race is a pre-scientific folk taxonomy based on superficial phenotypic attributes like hair and skin color, which are what biologists call polyphyletic, that is, derived from multiple ancestral sources. Compare, for instance, the dark skin of sub-Saharan Africans with that of the genetically distant Australian Aborigines. Race, as commonly understood, is therefore a social construct, but this is not to say that there is no biological variation due to ancestry, only that traditional race categories are not a good way to understand that variation. Race realists like to use dog breeds as a counterexample that's supposed to show that everything I've said so far would imply that the distinction between Chihuahuas and Great Danes is a social construct, which they take to be self-evidently absurd. Now, this is a bad analogy, since dog breeds are deeply inbred by human design, whereas human populations are constantly mating outside the group. However, the example does provide an interesting illustration of the relationship between social constructs and biology. Dog breeds are biologically real because of human social practices, so in a sense, dog breeds are biologically distinct, although they're not natural. And this biology-nature distinction is a useful distinction to have, since racial injustice can lead to conditions of poverty, malnutrition, environmental toxins, and so on that can then have a biological effect. So just like with gender, we shouldn't think of race as either biological or a social construct. It's both, and the relationship between biology and society is very complex, and it involves causation in both directions. So when I say race is a social construct, I'm not saying that biologists and anthropologists shouldn't use categories like haplogroups and clines to describe human populations. I'm simply saying that race is at best a very crude approximation of these categories. And that crude approximation may well be useful in certain forensic and medical contexts, but we should keep in mind that categories of race are based more on social and political divisions than pure biology. The racial categories used in the US Census are the product of the political history of the United States. People who we'd consider white, black, and Hispanic here might be categorized totally differently in Brazil, where different demographics and history have led to different race concepts.
This is all good and well, but when are we going to measure the skulls?
If I may quote a friend of mine, what is it with you people and skulls?
Is it so wrong to enjoy the touch of cold bones?
Part 2. The origin of the idea of race. Race realists like to talk about race as if it were a natural, intuitive concept believed by everyone except a few politically correct postmodernists who have somehow deceived themselves into not seeing the obvious. It's therefore worth looking at the history of the concept of race to see if it's really as universal as they say. I'll start, like any true defender of Western civilization, with ancient Greece. I can find no evidence that the Greeks had anything like our concept of race, that is, a division of human beings into different kinds with unique physical and psychological attributes on the basis of ancestry. This is not to say that the Greeks had no concept of ethnicity. They definitely did, and a very ethnocentric one at that. There were Greeks, and there were the obviously inferior barbarians, that is, non-Greeks. But the Greeks defined themselves and distinguished themselves from, say, the Persians or Egyptians by their language and customs, not their biology or ancestry. Aristotle's political philosophy included the idea of natural slaves, people who are by nature the tools and property of the natural masters. Now, Greek slavery was not based on race, so there was no need to introduce a concept of race to justify it. Instead, Aristotle introduces a natural slave class to explain why slavery is totally natural and fine, don't even worry about it, like literally at all. But clearly this is just a post hoc biological rationalization for the political hierarchy of the time. There are no slave Greeks or master Greeks, but it's a lot easier to see that when your society is not founded on the idea of there being slave Greeks. So with that in mind, it should not come as much of a surprise that Europeans first really started talking about race in the 17th century, around the time that slavery and colonialism were really kicking into gear.
My time has come!
Your time has gone.
Oh.
Arguably, the ideas of this goddamn bastard were first foreshadowed during the Spanish Inquisition, when Christian converts became suspect, and Torquemada started inquiring into defendants' ancestry using pure Christian bloodline as a criterion of religious authenticity. Race first became the object of scientific study with François Bernier's 1684 treatise on the subject. Until around the time of Charles Darwin, scientific racism was the only game in town, with naturalists, anthropologists, and philosophers generally ranking the races, always with Caucasians at the top, using such scientific criteria as dietary and sartorial customs, physical beauty, and alleged sexual appetite. Here's Carl Linnaeus, creator of our genus species nomenclature, on the subject of the Asiaticus. Yellow, melancholic, stiff. Black hair, dark eyes. Severe, haughty, greedy. Covered with loose clothing, and regulated by opinions. And here is Johann Friedrich Blumenbach on the term Caucasian, which he coined. I have taken the name of this variety from Mount Caucasus, both because its neighborhood, and especially its southern slope, produces the most beautiful race of men, I mean the Georgian, and because all physiological reasons converge to this, that in that region, if anywhere, it seems we ought with the greatest probability to place the autochthonies of mankind. And here's Immanuel Kant, who never left his hometown.
The Yellow Indians do have a meager talent. The Negroes are far below them, and at the lowest point are a part of the American people.
Wow, very science, much objective, so reason! Basically what happened is that scientific insights, not much exceeding the drunken hunches of any backwoods doofus, were used, along with some self-interested biblical hermeneutics, to justify centuries of slavery and colonialism. And the situation didn't improve much by the beginning of the last century, when crude biological determinism was used to justify an American eugenics program of immigration restriction, forced sterilization, and euthanasia that later inspired the Nazis. Speaking of which, let's not forget about the Jews. Hitler's deputy Rudolf Hess famously said that National Socialism is nothing but applied biology, and we could call this way of thinking biopolitics. The idea is that the nation is the race, and the race is like an organism. So people of other races, homosexuals, degenerates, criminals, race traitors, and so on, are contaminants, vermin, or agents of infection. It follows from this view that immigration should be banned, homosexuals should be euthanized or cured, and this also applies to trans people by the way, and degenerates and criminals should be sterilized. Now I know you're probably saying, Godwin's law! You compare everyone you disagree with to Hitler and the Holocaust. But look, the historical facts are what they are, and I understand that it's upsetting to you that I would dare bring this up, but I don't respect your willful obliviousness to historical precedent. The historical record shows that race has always been a political concept, and an extremely dangerous one at that. So my view that race is not a valid biological concept is not a case of political correctness invading biology. In fact, it's exactly the opposite, an effort to liberate biology from an inherently political concept that it doesn't need and that humanity is better without.
Yes, but then how will we know to which of the four humors the races correspond?
Well gee, I guess we'll never know. Part 3. Race as a social construct and individual identity. Race may be a social construct, but it's not an illusion. It's real in the way that money is real. It affects the way we all experience the world, and real people are privileged and disadvantaged because of it. So even if our goal is a society where race doesn't exist, we can't get there by denying the political reality of race and racial injustice. Colorblindness, in other words, is not the answer. However, as society becomes more multiracial and as there are more mixed-race people around, it does get harder and harder to say what the nature of race as a social construct is. The ambiguity of race was highlighted by the case of Rachel Dolezal, a white woman who fabricated her biography and lived for a decade passing as a black woman. Now, I'm not convinced there's a legitimate analogy between race and gender when it comes to psychological self-identification, so I don't think Rachel Dolezal is black. But I do think her story raises complicated questions about what makes a person black or white. Is it the way people perceive you, or a certain cultural upbringing, or maybe having certain racial experiences, like being disadvantaged or oppressed in certain ways? Because Rachel Dolezal lied about so many of her experiences, she's maybe not a great case study. But suppose, hypothetically, it turned out that one of her parents was black after all. Or suppose she really were the victim of hate crimes, or was discriminated against due to her perceived blackness, or suppose she was raised by black parents. I don't think there is a definite answer to whether a person in those circumstances is black or white, but I do think that asking the question reveals the inherent ambiguity of the concept of race.
Alright, Doc, I can't stand it anymore. When are we gonna measure these bones?
Oh my god, shut up about the fucking bones.
Well, can I at least do blackface?
Absolutely not.
Well, why not? Are you too politically correct?
Well, I did this fucking shit and people still haven't forgiven me.
Alright, so hear me out.
No.
It's ironic blackface, like the
No.
joke is that it's racist.
You are an actual lord of shit, you know that?
Well, what if I only do half of my face? as
Still
blackface?
no.
That's not racist, is it?
No, it's still racist.
One dot of black paint isn't racist.
Shut
so
up.
how much of my face has to be painted black before it's racist?
Look, you want to measure some bones? Why don't we start with yours? I like to grind the dust of racist bones. I like to mix it with my milk. It's how I stay so white. It's how I stay so pure. Using such scientific criteria as dietary and sartorial custom.
Wait a minute. No way. He didn't. No, he did. He used a satire image from an issue of Harper's Magazine dedicated to mocking the Irish. In that same magazine, the creators used these super serious images to portray the Irish. Oh boy, when they fall for the Harper's lineup, which I've seen before, you just know that this video is going to be something very special indeed.
Yea, verily.
So ContraPoints made a race denial video a while back, and a bunch of people have wanted me to respond. He made it a long time ago, but I'm back on YouTube, so I figured why not. ContraPoints actually spends most of the video either poisoning the well or playing dress up, not much time dealing with the actual topic. And we'll deal with his well poisoning, but first let's deal with his scientific race denial, which is all very pedestrian. So his arguments: first, he has more variation within than between. Always a classic. Second, the continuum fallacy. Solid choice for a race denial lineup. And his third argument is race categories don't map to genetic clusters. He has a particularly stupid variant of this using haplogroups. Who here remembers concordance? If you do, well then, you're in for a treat. So, more variation within than between. Vintage Lewontin.
It's pretty well known that around 85% of genetic variation is found within groups, meaning that any two individuals from different populations are not likely to be much more different than any two individuals from the same population. And only around 6 to 10% of total variation is found between continental groups.
The quickest way to show that this is a stupid and not an argument is to point to chimpanzees. Depending on which loci you use for the analysis, there's more variation within humans and chimpanzees than between them. You can also model gender differences as an FST distance, treating the Y chromosome and deactivated analogs on the X chromosome as an allele frequency difference of 100%, which just means 100% variation at those gene locations. And oh look, more variation within than between. And in fact, the gender differences, despite being typological differences, because they're only at a few loci, they're actually swamped by the race differences. Moreover, more variation within than between is true for basically every species that has an identifiable subspecies. I've compiled a list of mammals that have FST distances around that of humans, which means they all have more variation within than between. I guess brown bears and polar bears don't have typological differences because there's more variation within than between. So, are we done? To ContraPoints and to any, race denier listener here, are we done with this stupid argument? Keep in mind that the more variation within than between argument, this is a pub shock argument. It's not an argument that influenced any actual population geneticist, okay? But that last line he makes is particularly annoying.
Meaning that any two individuals from different populations are not likely to be much more different than any two individuals from the same population.
This is one of those little shitballs that takes longer to respond to than it does to make. And a simplified way to explain why this is wrong is to use binomial probability. Nevin Sasardik does a much more in-depth explanation than this, but think of each gene as a loaded coin flip. And say with each coin flip you have a 60% chance of being more similar to someone of your own genetic cluster, however defined, than to someone of another cluster. If humans only had one gene, i.e. one coin flip, well, you would be more similar to someone of another cluster only around 40% of the time, and would only have a greater similarity to someone within your cluster 60% of the time. If you have 20 genes, this goes up to around 75%. If you have 100 genes, this goes up to something like 96 or 97%. And by the time you get to 500 genes or 500 coin flips, you're at virtually 100% chance of being more similar to someone in your own cluster than to someone in another cluster. Of course, in reality, it's not quite like this. It's not that you have a 10% chance of greater similarity evenly distributed across the whole genome to another person in your cluster. That's just the average. In reality, it's more like you have a 90% chance of greater similarity at a few locations, and everywhere else it's like 50%, 50%, 51%, 50%, 98%, 50%, 50%. It's like that. ContraPoints then shows a haplogroup map.
including across continental divides. So there are no distinct boundaries separating continental populations from each other, and the continental populations themselves are not homogeneous. This is evident when you look at, for instance, the distribution of Y chromosome haplogroups across the globe. Categories like white, black, and Asian are therefore extremely arbitrary ways of dividing up the genetic continuum.
Now, first off, this is stupid because if we compare, say, Europeans and Native Americans, we can see with his own chart visually a typological distinction between these two ends in terms of haplogroup. And so ContraPoints' argument for race denial here is based entirely on the continuum fallacy, right? On these mixed intermediate populations. So, like, do we have to explain the continuum fallacy, that a muddled middle doesn't preclude categorical distinctions between any particular population comparison? Is this really the level we're at? Like, middle schoolers don't come up with arguments this stupid. But more basic than that, haplogroups are just ancestral lines. They're not whole genomic genetic clusters. They're not best fit genetic clusters when you set K to 10 or something. The purpose of haplogroup analysis is just to trace back evolutionary lineage, not necessarily genetic similarity. Of course, there's going to be some relation in that people of the same haplogroup will tend to be more genetically similar to each other than they are to people of different haplogroups, but haplogroups are not genetic similarity clusters. They're not best fit genetic clusters using some sort of algorithm, okay? And so this is not the appropriate thing to use when we're talking about races. Not surprisingly, since he took everything else from Concordance, ContraPoints then parrots Concordance's stupid argument that the classical races don't map onto haplogroups.
The upshot is that while geneticists and physical anthropologists can divide humans into populations based on ancestry, there is no scientific reason for those divisions to track traditional race categories.
Well, no shit, Sherlock, why would they? Races were based on physiological and psychological characteristics, not maternal or paternal lineage. But races do map onto best fit genetic clusters, and this is a well-replicated finding. There are several studies where they take a person's self-identified race, then look at their DNA, and tell a computer to blindly classify the DNA into a certain number of clusters based on the people that are giving their DNA. And when the number of clusters used is the same as the number of classical races identified, you get basically a 100% correspondence, or very close to it, between the classical races and best fit cluster. Now, one thing ContraPoints and Concordance like to say is that the number of clusters is arbitrary, that there's no genetic reason to have 7 or 5 or 300.
In fact, there is no purely genetic justification for using, say, 5 race categories as opposed to just 1 or 300 or 3 million.
Well, whoop-de-doo! I mean, okay, so the number of colors is arbitrary. Purple doesn't exist. And he only uses this argument when talking about humans. He doesn't have a big bug up his butt when he's talking about the number of divisions that we divide foxes or bears or wolves into, right? This is a human-specific criticism, right? And this is all apparently part of a lame thought experiment he had about aliens, right? Imagining that aliens would classify humans along haplogroup lines because he doesn't know what a haplogroup is. So that's the actual arguments, to the extent you can even call them that, done with. Concordance isn't saying anything new, he's just repeating stock nonsense from the 1970s. More variation within than between continuum fallacy and real genetic categories don't map to the races. The only twist he had was in the third argument, and it was stupid in that he used haplogroups instead of best fit clusters. Other than that, it was all just the classics. One tell of extreme ideology in ContraPoints is the use of the term pure.
And because of global gene flow, there are no pure races, no matter how many categories you choose, with the possible exception of some Pacific Islanders. This is especially true in countries with recent global immigration, like the US and Brazil, where mixed European, African, and Amerindian ancestry is the norm. These points are all made more eloquently and in much more detail in a 2-part video by Concordance, which I highly recommend and have linked to in the description.
He lashes out at people who recognize evolution in humans with the implication that we're obsessed with some kind of weird purity.
I just want to be pure.
Okay, he then says there has been gene flow. But of course, really important question, how much has there been and what impact has this had on the similarity of psychological traits and what this means for the functionality of a multiracial state in the real world? But to him, none of this matters. These aren't real questions, because in his little world, apparently I
Just wanna be pure.
ContraPoints then makes up a story about how the old-timey racial thinkers lumped Melanesians in with Africans, when in reality they were categorized as distinct from Africans at first contact in 1788, based on their differences from black African populations in appearance and behavior. ContraPoints, he just doesn't know anything. He then has a whole little section about how dog breeds aren't analogous to human races because they were intensively bred. Like, why is he so hard up on this when there are so many other species with recognized subspecies that humans are analogous to, both in terms of total heterozygosity and clusteredness? It's because he doesn't know. He spends a whole pointless section talking about domestic dog breeds, ignorant that there's like at least 100 other mammals analogous to humans in terms of amount of clusteredness of genetic diversity. It's a completely made-up exclusion criteria anyway. Humans have had as much selection in the past 5,000 years as they had in the past 500,000 years. And so the highly compressed recent human evolution is closer to the experience of domestic dog breeds than it is to other wild animals. So the analogy between human races and domestic dog breeds is far more appropriate than most people realize. Both are the result of intensive human-directed breeding. But again, like, who cares? Right? We have all these other wild mammals with similar heterozygosity and clusteredness levels, which all have recognized subspecies, so we don't even need domestic dog breeds to point out the hypocrisy and double standards used to deny races in humans. But what race denial video would be complete without some historically illiterate well poisoning? He spends a bunch of time talking about
The Nazis.
but, to my amazement, didn't once consider how this kind of argument could boomerang back onto him. Now, you'd think genocide would be a no-go zone for any kind of blank slate social constructivist thinker, but I guess not. It's so kitsch for me to have to do this, but okay, let's compare the kill counts of the communist, new socialist man regimes to Hitler. Look, they're bigger, they're more recent, and unlike Nazism, the kind of bizarro blank slate Marxoid thinking that led to these atrocities are actually more in line with what's popular in universities than the dreaded race realists, right? Whereas Aryanism or Hyperboreanism, that the stuff that informed Hitler's thinking, simply doesn't exist at all in the universities, and in fact, it doesn't even exist among the race realists. In addition, the countries that ultimately defeated Hitler all had white nationalist policies, and their popular thinking on race back then was what we today would call race realism. Back then it wasn't called race realism, it was just called biology and anthropology. A majority in the US at the time supported racial segregation, and white-only immigration policies were so totally supported that it wasn't even a topic of debate or any kind of polling. Which is to say that the kind of racial thinking that most closely approximates mine was actually the chief culprit in defeating Nazi Germany. The closest analog to how ContraPoints thinks on race at that time would be the Soviet Union. So basically, race realists defeated Hitler and are now being blamed for Hitler, while the blank slate crap that justified communist mass killings never gets linked to those whose views are much closer to them than mine are to Hitler. ContraPoints also brings up discrimination, but the only discrimination he points to is whites wanting to have their own spaces free from blacks. Meanwhile, ContraPoints supports institutional discrimination against whites, not just segregation, where you have, the black schools and the white schools, the black businesses, the white businesses, the black towns and the white towns, or a mixed area for people who want it. Right? No. He wants all the schools discriminating against whites. This is called affirmative action, and it's justified with equalist thinking. Yes, right, because race doesn't exist. All inequalities between the races must be a result of non-genetic factors, circumstance, environment. Therefore, discrimination against whites is justified until outcomes are equalized. So, while ContraPoints kvetches about discrimination, the real institutional discrimination that actually exists is against whites, and it's justified with ContraPoints' kind of flat earth approach to human biology. And unlike segregation of the past, it is totalitarian in nature. ContraPoints makes it clear that we cannot totally divorce discussions of race from the real political context, and I agree. Flat Earth theories of human biology have proven to be much more dangerous than evolution-based theories of human biology, and are a clear and present danger today, and are used to justify discrimination against whites today, which is why we shouldn't be so eager to rush headlong into Marxoid biology-denying arguments that tend to get people killed. He then makes a bunch of just really irresponsible claims. For example, the claim that colonialism and slavery were justified by racism. Of course, this is just retconning. Europe was doing what literally all states prior had done, which was to expand and conquer as much as they can get away with. The only thing unique about the European empires was how they took over most of the world and then decided to give up their empires without them being taken away from them militarily or from collapsing internally. Conquering and enslaving was the norm for all of human existence. What was unique about Europe was not that they did it, but that Europe eventually ended it. And they ended it around the time that scientific racial thinking started to become popular, with Darwin's book, quote, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Saying that Europeans justified slavery with scientific racism is just retconning. One way we kinda know that scientific racism was not the justification for slavery in the US is that in the US it ended in 1865, while the scientific study of race did not go into decline until after World War II. For obvious reasons, and scientific racism is largely considered to have peaked in the 1920s. Basically, the idea that scientific theories of race were the primary justifier for colonialism and slavery doesn't fit the timeline, given that such ideas didn't begin to be noticeably informing the public debate until towards the end of the empires and after slavery. ContraPoints then brings up some stupid quotes from some guys in the 1700s talking about race. Well, good for them. I can find some stupid things that some biology deniers thought. I can't find specific quotes because I'd have to go through and read a whole bunch of stuff again, but I can tell you the ideas right here. Franz Boas treated culture as a thing sui generis that acted independently of biology, that culture was a superorganism that acted through, though independent of, human biology. Or we can talk about Margaret Mead, who wrote in Coming of Age in Samoa that monogamy was purely a Western social construct and that virginity was not valued. Turns out Margaret Mead, instead of investigating the Samoans, just asked them. And the Samoans, of course, told her a bunch of lies, and she published them. Franz Boas, not surprisingly, gave a ringing endorsement of her book. And let's not forget Lysenkoism, the belief that evolution doesn't come from natural selection, but from adaptation to the environment. Natural selection was castigated as bourgeois science. According to Lysenko, the first generation would adapt, for example, to the cold a little bit. And when they had kids, that kid would already be adapted, and then would be able to adapt a little more. And so it was through each generation's adaptations to the environment layered on top of each other that evolution occurred. This led to the firings and less often executions of over 3,000 bourgeois biologists and geneticists, and Lysenkoism was the official doctrine of the Soviet Union from 1927 to 1964, and is credited with having stunted the development of Soviet biology, psychology, and of course, genetics. Or we can go way back and go back to Greek and Roman times when they believed that sun exposure caused long-term skin darkening and changes to appearance and behavior, and that it was the sun exposure that caused black Africans to have the black skin and to be violent and lazy, and that it was the lack of sun exposure to the Germanic peoples to the north that caused them to have light skin and to be violent. Wow, environmental explanations for variations in human biology in the past sure were stupid. Isn't this fun? Right? Finding all these stupid little anecdotes. Look at all these stupid things that environmental determinists in the past believed. Wow, they were really, really stupid. I now proclaim this to be the intellectual firmament in which ContraPoints comes from, and that all you are, ContraPoints, is a modern rationalization of those past stupid ideas.
Concepts.
This is all good and well, but when are we going to measure the skulls?
If I may quote a friend of mine, what is it with you people and skulls?
Is it so wrong to enjoy the touch of cold bones?
Guys, something that's going to happen here, this is actually like really funny. because he has like a fetish for bone and skulls, and it's like, and he's gonna put his finger into the skull, and it's gonna be like having sex with the skull. And this is like really funny and worth like thousands of likes and like a bunch of money being given to him for this.
If you want to have an honest conversation about race on the internet, here's what you do. You set your computer on fire, you flee to the forest, you drink a mimosa laced with toad venom, and you simply wait for the wolverines to eat your legs. Trust me, you're better off that way, because if you look for videos on YouTube about race, well, here's what you get. You get fascism, racist pseudoscience, racist debate fascists tag team title match tonight at 9, or if you're lucky, you get this.
So perhaps our legal system isn't going around willy-nilly convicting innocent black people of crimes they didn't commit. Perhaps individuals who happen to be black are making bad choices for which they have to deal with the consequences.
Racism isn't the explanation for everything bad that happens to black people. If blacks are getting shot and going to jail more, it's their fault for committing crimes.
That's right. Racial inequality in America exists because black people simply decide to commit more crimes for no reason. I guess he's probably gonna blame the rap music, or deadbeat dads with their sagging pants. I'd say that this is the most common right-wing view of race in America. It's not outright fascism or race realism, but simply the classical liberal view that racial inequality is the product not of injustice, but of black people simply deciding to make bad choices. Usually this idea gets whipped out as a way to wave away the indisputable facts of racial inequality and dismiss those pesky protesters always complaining about things. They make me uncomfortable and I don't like it. This is what I'm gonna argue against in this video. We're gonna take a break from talking about fascism. In the past, I've focused too much on the alt-right. I think we all have. I mean, don't get me wrong, it definitely is a dangerous movement, but it's just not the most consequential kind of white supremacy that exists in America. In this video, I want to talk about the real root of racial inequality in America, which is the structural injustice that disadvantages many people of color. And from now on, I'm going to try not to get so distracted by this circus sideshow of Pepes and racist Odinists and neo-Nazi LARPers. All that stuff, it's very last season. I'm kind of over it. Oh, god damn it.
Hallo Leute.
Fritz, get the hell out of here. No one cares about you anymore.
Nein, ich heiße nicht mehr Fritz. Nenn mich jetzt Freya.
What?
Ich bin jetzt eine Frau.
Great. Get out.
Well, don't you want to hear about my transition?
No, I don't care. No one cares. You're still a Nazi. Get out.
But I'm trans. How could I possibly be a Nazi?
That's a good question. It's almost as if you're an irrational person and your worldview makes no sense. Get out.
She calls me a Nazi, and yet she's the one trying to silence my free speech. An excellent example of how truly fascist the left has become. Look, if your ideas stand up to rational scrutiny, why aren't you willing to discuss them in the free marketplace of ideas?
Well, I'm going to discuss them in the free marketplace of ideas as soon as you get out of my room. Mom, get out of my life.
Well, can we at least talk about the Jewish question?
No.
It's just ideas. What are you afraid of?
I'm afraid that I'm going to have to blow the tabby whistle if you don't get out of here in 10 seconds. 10, 9.
Oh, baby,
8,
come on.
7,
I thought you liked to be.
6.
You used to whisper to me so sweetly.
Well, not anymore.
Well, do you at least want to buy some Vitalamax? Okay, Jesus.
I don't like doing this. I prefer to have conversations about disagreements. I don't enjoy waving a bat around and hissing like a cat, but it's these people, they just give you no choice. Where were we? Right, so racial injustice. When I talk to people about this issue, they often claim to have this experience that leftists react to them in two ways. One, by saying you're racist, and two, by saying it's not my job to educate you. And I'm sure this isn't as universal as people say it is, but it does seem to be an experience a lot of people have. And that's not good, because most people are pretty ignorant about this, no offense, and there's no shortage of fascists, race realists, and classical liberals who are more than happy to educate people in their own special way. So as I see it, the left needs to step it up. Now to be fair, if you're bothering random people of color on Twitter to demand they explain racism to you, you're being kind of an asshole. And it's true, it's not their job to explain it to you. They have other shit to do with their lives. But I, on the other hand, do not have anything better to do than swerve wildly out of my lane and white-splain racism to you for the next 20 minutes. Because it kind of is my job, and I have all the time in the world. It's a funny thing, time. Whose job is it to mend the crimes of history? Do we have to take responsibility for things that happened a long time ago? I don't even take responsibility for things I did before July. This person, who the fuck is that? No, I don't have any white guilt. That's not what this is about. That's just more white narcissism is what that is. So wipe away those white ass tears. Here, I'll pick you out a cotton ball. Freddie Gray. On April 12, 2015, 3 police officers near a housing project in West Baltimore arrested a 25-year-old black man named Freddie Gray because he was carrying a spring-assisted knife that maybe was illegal. They handcuffed him and loaded him into a police van. When the van arrived at the police station, Gray was in a coma for some reason, with 3 fractured vertebrae and his spine 80% severed at the neck. A week later, Gray died of his spinal injury, while the Baltimore police released contradictory and inadequate information about his arrest. This led to widespread protests all over the city, eventually culminating in the notorious Baltimore riots. Now you might be thinking,
What does this have to do with racism? If black people don't want to be killed, then they shouldn't commit crimes and run away from the police.
well, the first problem with that is that extrajudicial executions for nonviolent crimes shouldn't really be a common thing in a civilized democracy, and it's a little alarming to me how quick you are to defend this. And the other problem is that that's a very superficial analysis that refuses to examine the deeper reasons why black neighborhoods tend to have more poverty, more crime, and are subject to more aggressive policing. So let's delve a little deeper, starting with Freddie Gray as a case study. Gray had a long arrest record of mostly drug offenses, and a lot of conservative commentators brought this out as evidence that he was no angel. The implication, I guess, is that Gray simply got what was coming to him, that he deserved to die. But why did he commit all these crimes in the first place? I don't think he was selling drugs for lack of entrepreneurial ambition. Did he just do it for no reason? Well, let's see. Freddie Gray was born in 1989 in the West Baltimore neighborhood Sandtown, Winchester. You can see in this picture of him as a child that he grew up in a dilapidated row house with peeling lead paint. Lead was used as a cheap additive in house paint until Congress banned it in 1978 because it causes serious cognitive damage in children, leading to deficits in attention and increased aggression, which may explain why children poisoned with lead are 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system. But shitty Baltimore slumlords often haven't bothered to comply with a congressional ban on lead paint, and as a result, 93,000 children with lead poisoning have been added to Maryland's lead registry, and in Baltimore, the vast majority of these children are black. Many of these kids were later awarded structured settlements as compensation for permanent brain damage, and Freddie Gray was one of these kids. Now, you might be thinking,
Well, reparations were paid out, so problem solved, right?
well, unfortunately, no. What's happened is a sub-industry has emerged of shark lawyers who swoop in on the lead poisoning victims, some of whom can't even read a contract, and offer to buy out their structured monthly settlements in exchange for a lump sum that's a fraction of the total worth of the settlement. And that's exactly what happened to Freddie Gray. In 2013, a company called Access Funding bought the $146,000 remainder of his settlement for $18,300. They also bought his sister's settlements, acquiring the entire $435,000 Gray siblings settlement for $54,000. Now I hope we can all agree that this is objectively bad, but to understand how it relates to structural racism, we have to look at Baltimore's history of racial segregation. Or, we could just keep doing live streams with Richard Spencer. Interviews with Nazis, the new YouTube craze. God damn it, I need to relax. I need music. 2. Housing discrimination. Take a look at this map, which shows Baltimore neighborhoods with children with elevated lead levels between 2010 and 2013, and compare it with this map of Baltimore's racial demographics, yellow dots standing for black residents and blue dots standing for white. Lead, race, lead, race. Also, notice how sharp the divisions are between black and white neighborhoods. Why, in the 21st century, is Baltimore still so segregated? I thought racism was over. Well, here's the thing about that. When your country's history is 400 years of slavery, Jim Crow, and segregation, you don't just get to say, oops, sorry about that. It's all cool now though, right? No! It's not cool, and these maps are a pretty good illustration of one of the major not cool things. Let's look at how this shit happened in the first place. I hope I'm not being too controversial if I propose that 100 years ago, America may have been somewhat racist. In 1910, a Yale-educated black lawyer named W. Ashby Hawkins bought a house in a prestigious white Baltimore neighborhood. This produced such an uproar among the white residents that the city passed an ordinance mandating the segregation of every residential block. Basically, the ordinance forbade black people to buy or rent houses on majority white blocks, and vice versa, until the Supreme Court overturned the ordinance in 1917.
Well, if the Supreme Court overturned the Jim Crow laws, then what's the problem? Racism can't exist if black people have all the same rights as white people.
Well, No, that's actually not correct. In 1934, Congress created the Federal Housing Administration to promote homeownership in the midst of the Great Depression, when many homes were foreclosed. One of the FHA's purposes was to establish a reliable credit system backed by the government, which would regulate interest rates and ensure the terms of mortgages. FHA-backed loans played a critical role in facilitating homeownership throughout the middle of the 20th century, the period many white Americans now remember as the golden age of the American dream. But many black Americans were excluded from homeownership and the benefits it conferred to white families, particularly the family financial stability it enabled. So how was this exclusion possible? Well, basically, the FHA, city governments, and white citizens adopted a variety of subtle methods to enforce residential segregation and deny homeownership to black Americans. For instance, 1. Restrictive covenants. When the 1910 ordinance was overturned, Baltimore's mayor created an official Committee on Segregation, which cooperated with neighborhood associations to pressure landlords in white neighborhoods to sign covenants committing them never to sell or rent to black residents. These agreements were enforced through strategic building and health code citations issued against owners and by evictions of black renters who violated the covenant. 2. Redlining. The FHA adopted a policy of refusing to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods, which were colored in red on official maps, giving the practice the name redlining. This effectively denied black citizens access to government-backed mortgages, which, in turn, left them vulnerable to 3. Predatory lending. Unscrupulous white sellers took advantage of black buyers' exclusion from FHA-backed mortgages, exploiting lax regulations to design unfairly priced installment plans with abusive terms, which allowed, for instance, sellers to repossess and resell homes after a single missed payment. Many black residents had no choice but to buy into these exploitative contracts, and they often resorted to subdividing houses or neglecting repairs in order to make payments, further contributing to the overcrowding and decay of black neighborhoods. 4. Blockbusting. Predatory real estate agents often used a scheme known as blockbusting, where they'd intentionally provoke fear of an impending minority takeover among residents of a white neighborhood. They would then exploit the fear that they created to trick white homeowners into selling their houses at below market prices, so they could resell those same houses at extortionate prices to black families desperate to escape the ghetto. The long-term effect of these practices was that many black families ended up trapped in decaying neighborhoods with bad schools, little opportunity, cyclical crime and poverty, and aggressive, discriminatory policing. And even though most of these segregation practices have ended, the injustice remains unredressed. No reparations have been paid to black families who were effectively robbed of homeownership during this period, predatory lending having cost black families an estimated $500 million in Chicago alone. But worst of all is that segregation and ghettoization caused by government-backed discrimination of the last century is still ongoing. I'm currently sitting in my gentrifying white fucking neighborhood like 1 mile away from where Freddie Gray was arrested, in a neighborhood that's like a whole different country. Here's the 1937 redlining map of Baltimore. Now compare that to the 2013 population by race map. If the 1937 map is the product of racism, and it is, and if the city still follows the same pattern of segregation today, and it does, well, it's almost as if the effects of racism have not entirely been eradicated. And it's not just Baltimore that's like this either. Here are redlining maps of New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Detroit, New Orleans, Cleveland, LA. All of these cities are still segregated as shit, and it's not like a separate but equal situation either. Compare the 2013 population by race map of Baltimore to this map of Baltimore police stops between 2010 and 2015. That's black neighborhoods in red and green dots representing recorded police stops of black pedestrians. And finally, let's bring back the map of childhood lead poisoning between 2010 and 2013. Now consider this information in combination with some scientific studies linking lead exposure and violent crime, and it almost starts to look like there's some problems going on here that might not be solved simply by telling black teenagers to tighten their belts and do less crimes. But I don't want to overstate the lead crime theory either, because that only accounts for a small fraction of what's going on here. The bigger picture is the lasting economic deprivation caused by segregation, the historical exclusion from homeownership, the lost opportunities, the bad schools, and this country's ongoing insistence on treating a problem of injustice as if it were simply a problem of criminality. I know I said my interest in this topic isn't a matter of white guilt, and it's not, but also, fellow whites, how do we sleep at night? In this guided meditation, you're going to relax your body and release your guilt. You're not responsible for what your great-grandparents did. As you ease the tension in each muscle group, exhale deeply and repeat the mantra, Black Lives Matter are the real racists.
3. Mass incarceration.
Since the 1970s, the United States incarceration rate has rapidly risen to the point where nearly 1 in 100 American men are in jail or prison. We now have the highest incarceration rate in the world, accounting for 22% of the world's prisoners, though we make up only 4.4% of the world's population. More than a third of the total incarcerated population is black, and the black incarceration rate is almost 6 times that of whites. Now, without even bringing race into it, it's clear that America has a prison problem in general. Sentences are too long, too many nonviolent drug offenders are in prison, too many defendants are pressured into plea bargains, and a private prison industry incentivizes high rates of incarceration. But disproportionately, people of color are victimized by this system. Now, a lot of people are going to look at the incarceration data and say, if the blacks don't like going to jail, they should just do less crimes. Let's do another interview with Richard Spencer. You know what? Why don't we all interview Richard Spencer? Every single YouTuber. Free speech mandates that we all constantly broadcast fascist propaganda. Let's get them all in here, every single Nazi in one giant live stream, and then we can finally give the Jewish question the platform it deserves. God damn it. Where's my toad venom? Look, it's just not always the case that black people are imprisoned more because they commit more crimes. For instance, black and white people use weed at about the same rate, but black people are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for it. And we're talking about a drug that, at this point, white America has basically decided shouldn't really even be illegal anyway. So we've now got a $10 billion legal marijuana industry. And just look what white people are doing to weed.
Mark Smith is the CEO of Tumbleweed, a ganjapreneur.
It's a strong sativa, very high in limonene. It's a great bronchodilator, so I like to use it when I work out.
Yeah, so in fact, in the back of a limousine is one of the only legal places you can consume cannabis.
The whites are at it again. They have gentrified the marijuana. And now we've got white business people making millions of dollars selling the same drug that black people are still disproportionately incarcerated for having sold.
A ganjapreneur.
What do I do with the gold on my fingers?
This is the most basic kind of unfairness. And if this doesn't make you angry, then either you're really ignorant about this or you might just not care about black people. I don't like to assume the worst of people, but when I look at the state of the conversation about race in America, I see a lot of people who are willing to just wave away the extrajudicial executions of black people by the police, the mass incarceration of people of color, and the vicious history of discrimination and its ongoing repercussions. And from those same people, I see a tendency to get extremely outraged by any black person who takes a stand or takes a knee or speaks up about this in any way. There's an endless mill of content about how authoritarian and evil Black Lives Matter is, and how it's identity politics equivalent to white nationalism, and it's unpatriotic and postmodern and racist. And I'm sorry, but this group of creators are being really melodramatic. Black college students complaining too loudly are not Orwell's nightmare. If anything in this country deserves to be called an authoritarian nightmare, it's locking people in cages for decades over drug offenses. But right-wing YouTube doesn't seem very interested in using their free speech to talk about that. They're too busy complaining about people using their free speech to protest? How dare they? Now, I can also anticipate another objection that doesn't come from YouTube fascists or stock, salad-eating basic white girl caricatures. I imagine some black people will probably watch this video and think, where does this white bitch get off telling me I'm a victim? I take responsibility for my own life instead of blaming all my problems on racism. And here's the thing about that. You're actually right in the sense that taking responsibility or taking control of your life to the greatest extent possible is actually a good way to live your life as an individual. So by all means, don't allow yourself to be defined by victimhood. Do take control of your destiny as much as possible. So I'm not saying anyone should blame all their problems on bigotry and wallow in victimhood. Please don't do that. Go succeed as much as possible. But also, while you're succeeding, don't deny that oppressive circumstances exist. Yes, it's possible for individuals to escape oppressive circumstances, but we also have a collective duty to work to eliminate the unjust conditions that create those circumstances in the first place. Wow. I feel like I just gave a great speech. Would you take my speech less seriously if you knew I had been drinking Bud Light Lime this entire time? Look, I even put a lime in it. Bud Light Lime with lime. The official beverage of people who complain about people who complain too much about people who complain too much about racism. For the final countdown. I want to say 2 more things before I flee into the forest. First, there actually are more racial groups in America than just black people and white people. I've just narrowed the topic of discussion so this video isn't 3 hours long. But there are lots of other kinds of racism in this country, and someone should make videos about those too. Second, please don't get all your information from YouTube. I've put some links in the description with my sources and some further reading on the topic. Also, don't get all your information about race and racism from white people. Like, come on, that should just be common sense. So when this video ends, what you should do is scroll down, smash that unsubscribe button, unclick that little bell so you no longer receive notifications about my videos, and then you should go subscribe to a bunch of people of color and listen to what they have to say. guess that's it. I was just kidding about the forests. I don't fuck with forests. I'm really more of an indoor tranny, so guess I'll just go sing a song about fighting racists. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. Death to capitalism and the patriarchy, smash the binary, hail Satan. Ow!
Tell me about these elements.
They are the four elements which comprise the very existence of your realm. They are earth, wind, water, and fire. With your mastery of the element of cold, you have an advantage that no other human has, and that is the ability to defeat the elements. I have foreseen this.
So ContraPoints likes to talk about lead, and this is another example of why we use data over anecdote and glittering generalities, like...
And as a result, 93,000 children with lead poisoning have been added to Maryland's lead registry, and in Baltimore, the vast majority of these children are black. Many of these kids were later awarded structured settlements as compensation for permanent brain damage.
Well, we actually have data from the CDC on this, and there's almost no race difference here. Yes, lead exposure does have effects, but this is the David Sherratt fallacy, confusing a potential cause for an actual cause. Sure, eating arsenic will lower your IQ, but to say that it's responsible for race differences in IQ, you have to show some sort of race difference in arsenic consumption.
But I don't want to overstate the lead crime theory either.
You overstated the importance of lead the moment you brought it up. This is what happens when you use shitlib rags as your sources instead of looking at primary data.
Please don't get all your information from YouTube. I've put some links in the description with my sources and some further reading on the topic.
You like to mock people who get their information from YouTube video makers? Well, here's an instance where they would be clearly better informed listening to a YouTube video maker, in this case me, than they would be listening to Vox or Atlantic or whatever trashy magazine you got your lead talking point from. And let me let you in on the little secret here. The people who write these articles don't know anything. They're mostly journalism majors, or in the odd occasion that they're experts, quote unquote, who have to write the science beat or whatever. These are just people who the journalists, all the journalism majors at the New York Times, or all the journalism majors at Fox, or all the journalism majors at the Atlantic, it's just people who these journalism majors, these know-nothings, happen to imagine is an expert. All right, enough grandstanding on this lead thing.
1. Freddie Gray.
Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray. Listen, I'm not going into your little funhouse here. I can find events of cops unfairly assaulting whites without due process too. Now, with normal people, I usually don't have to explain why we use statistics and not anecdotes. But with you, who knows, maybe you have to actually have it explained to you why we use data instead of stories. Your point with this is that cops are unfair to blacks, and there's a few ways we know this isn't the case. The first is that the racial ratios of the National Crime Victimization Survey and police arrests line up almost perfectly over the long run. If cops are unfairly targeting blacks, well, then I guess there's a whole conspiracy across the whole United States for people to claim to be victims of crime that just so happens to line up perfectly with police reports. The second reason we know cops aren't unfairly anti-black has to do with cop killers. Blacks make up 44% of the people who kill a policeman, but only 30% of those killed by a policeman. Whites and Hispanics are combined in the chart of cop killers and separated in the chart of those killed by cops. Now, if cops are unfairly targeting blacks, we would expect blacks to make up a greater proportion of those killed by cops than they are of the cop killers. The third reason we know cops aren't unfairly targeting blacks is that when cops are required to wear a body camera, they're actually more, not less, they are more likely to shoot a black person than when they're not wearing a body camera. This is the opposite of what you would predict if cops were unfairly targeting blacks. So put a camera on them so they can't get away with it. No, when the event is recorded, cops are actually more confident in shooting a black person. They are more likely to do that which needs to be done, not less. Another piece of evidence, and this is a little weaker, is experimental, where cops will play a simulation where they have to decide to shoot or not shoot people, very quickly. And cops actually take longer to shoot blacks than they do to shoot whites in these crime simulations. Now, personally, I don't think this is too meaningful. It is just a simulation after all. The cops could be trying to appear not racist for the simulation, though in fairness, the cops are not told at the beginning that their time on whether to shoot someone who's black or Hispanic or white, that the race differences in their time to shoot will be measured. So they're not told that this is going to be timed. But we just know that if the results showed that cops were more trigger happy with blacks, shitlibs would be all over this. Shitlibs would not be charitable about this at all and say, and we wouldn't say, it's just a simulation. No, they would be promoting this front and center if the results weren't what they are. And the last thing to consider among blacks is their disproportionate number of homicides compared to other crimes. Homicides have a dead body, and most of the time it's not a mystery whodunit. So we can compare homicides to other crimes and see that blacks are more overrepresented in homicides than they are in other crimes like rape, robbery, assault, which are all going to be massively influenced by reporting bias and by what the cops happen to catch. But homicide, this is much harder to hide, and the cops don't really have a lot of discretion on that. And on crimes where there's more subjectivity, more reporting issues, and the cops have some discretion whether or not to prosecute, blacks are actually less overrepresented than they are for homicides. When there's more discretion, blacks are less overrepresented, the opposite of what you would expect to see if the cops were unfairly targeting blacks. If the cops were unfairly targeting blacks, you would expect blacks to be more overrepresented in those crimes that have gray area or discretion. But the fact that it's the opposite is evidence that cops are kind of coddling blacks to a degree. So the plurality of evidence is that cops actually go easy on blacks a little bit. One last thing to add on this topic is that the incarceration rate ratio today between blacks and whites is actually higher than it was during Jim Crow. So if the cops in courts were anti-black during Jim Crow, well then they must be a lot more now. Or maybe, let's try this, maybe they were never biased against blacks. No, that can't be. Because you have all these data-phobic, quote-unquote, historians telling you cinematic stories about struggle and oppression that you just want to believe, right? So ContraPoints pushes the poverty causes crime myth. Of course there's going to be a correlation, but all this means is that criminals tend to be poor. Okay, so maybe the genes that drive one to criminality also tend to drive one to being poor. Certainly plausible genetic explanation, so at first glance this is a chicken and egg issue. But we have some natural experiments in the United States that can help settle this, where we can look at the change in the poverty rate and changes in crime. And what we find is that crime, both violent crime and property crime, tend to increase when the economy is doing well and tend to go down when the economy is doing poorly. On top of that, there are several countries in Eastern Europe, like Hungary and Poland, that are poorer than the US blacks but have a lower homicide rate. Homicide being the only crime I'm willing to compare between countries, and even then only within OECD countries that have a certain level of standardization for this stuff. And this ties into another point. Black Americans aren't poor. There are plenty of white populations around the world who are poorer than blacks who don't have any of the problems and pathologies that blacks in the US have. A study by Capasoa, Brialt, and Harrison in 1995 actually found that, with several other factors seen here controlled for, poverty actually is negatively correlated with property crime and with violent crime. This replicates what we see with the recessions in criminality, in that poverty appears to drive crime down, not up. Going to church also appears to have a causal effect of lowering both property and violent crime. The percent black beat out every factor for property crime except education level, population change, and percent urban, right? Education level of an area positively correlating with property crime. But the percent black in an area was the best predictor for violent crime.
The long-term effect of these practices was that many black families ended up trapped in decaying neighborhoods with bad schools.
Oh yes, bad schools. Bad schools, of course he did. The bad schools myth. The way we know the bad schools myth is a myth is from a form of natural experiment called lottery voucher studies. These are useful in that everyone has an opportunity to apply for a voucher, and the people who get them are randomly selected. So we can compare the people who got vouchers to those who didn't, and it's apples to apples because everyone in the study applied for them. And we can see the results of the lottery voucher program in Milwaukee, in Cleveland, and in Washington, D.C. Arguably, the Cleveland program showed improvement in the voucher population as the voucher kids did better at all grade levels. My issue with the Cleveland study, however, is that it started in grade 1, so we don't have any prior baseline, and the voucher students had a 9-point advantage in grade 1 and a 15-point advantage in grade 6, so it's not clear if it was the voucher program or that the people who got the voucher happened to just be better, that it was just a sampling error. And it could just be a random sampling error. But even if you think there wasn't any sample bias in the Cleveland study, the effects here are still marginal. And intuitively, I can think of a reason why a potentially smart person would do better in a quote-unquote bad school than a good school. If you're the only smart person, you'll get a lot more attention. You'll be able to develop more personal relationships with your teacher because you're the only one who has any desire to do so. You won't feel as pressured since you're far away the best person at school. Whereas if you're at a good school, you won't be anything special. As a result, you might not put as much effort into schoolwork because you're just another face. You're not the best. If you're the best, you're really gonna have that as your identity and put more effort into it, and you're gonna be more interested in it. And it's gonna be more fun because you're the one good student talking to the teachers, or maybe one of a small handful. But this is all just storytelling. But the point is that while you can certainly imagine ways in which a quote-unquote good school would be better for a given student, I can think of ways in which a quote-unquote bad school would actually be better for a student of any given ability level. And given that we can both tell stories about good schools and bad schools, we need to go back to the data. And the data says no effect, or if you want to look at the Cleveland study results, a very marginal effect. So ContraPoints brings up the drug use myth.
For instance, black and white people use weed at about the same rate, but black people are nearly 4 times as likely to be arrested for it. And we're talking about a drug that, at this point, white America has basically decided shouldn't really even be illegal anyway.
Now, the first major problem is all these studies are based on self-report, and there's several studies I have showing that blacks are more likely to lie about using drugs. They're anywhere from twice as likely to 25 times as likely to lie about their drug use than whites are, depending on the study. The second problem is that even if everyone was telling the truth, which is obviously not the case, it doesn't tell us how much they were using. For example, a study of 88 juvenile delinquents and hair cocaine content found that blacks who were arrested for whatever reason had 7 times as much cocaine content as inferred from hair analysis as whites who were arrested. So even if blacks and whites always told the truth about having ever used a certain drug, which they don't, it doesn't even tell us very much. And the more you use a drug, the more you buy a drug, well, the more chances there are of getting caught. If every black drug user on average uses drugs 7 times as often, you're going to expect them to get caught. more often, even if the total number of drug users is the same or even lower. On top of that, blacks are more than twice as likely to buy drugs outside as whites are, and over 3 times as likely to buy drugs from a stranger as whites are. So there you have it. Blacks probably do more drugs just in terms of total volume of drugs, not necessarily the number of people who ever use drugs one time. Blacks tend to lie about doing drugs anywhere from 2 to 25 times as much as whites, so all this data ContraPoints uses based on self-report is rendered dubious from that alone. And blacks are 2 and 3 times more likely to buy drugs outside and from a stranger, where they are more likely to get caught by a snitch or by a sting operation. ContraPoints says that these drug laws are really shitty, and I mostly agree. I agree that drug users shouldn't be thrown in jail, but these substances do create an addiction, and the ability to weigh the consequences of your actions is heavily impaired under the influence of these substances. So I think drug users need help, but drug dealers need the bullet. But that said, the idea that blacks are unfairly targeted for drug crimes, this is very tenuous. Your self-report data is crap for all the reasons that I laid out here.
2. Redlining. The FHA adopted a policy of refusing to insure mortgages in black neighborhoods, which were colored in red on official maps.
Okay, I've been over this before in my video response to Spooge Job Soy Pants from College Humor, so alright, let's get into this. We know that since the 1950s, the black-white gap in home ownership has been roughly the same. Moreover, since the 1970s, residential segregation in the United States has increased when redlining was actually outlawed. These are both reasons why it's pretty apparent that, pardon my French here, but redlining appears to not have mattered. Redlining, for all the hubbub about redlining, probably didn't matter, at least in terms of the effects then versus the effects today. And this is because banks today actually engage in pure racial discrimination just like they did back then. Now, please don't demand a source on this. This is actually a shitlib talking point. Like, Tim Wise brings this up all the time. I'm tired, this is true, just accept it. Banks do regularly engage in pure racial discrimination. When credit score is controlled for, banks are still more likely to lend to a white person than they are to a black person. But the hell of it is, the default rate by race is within 2% of each other. So this is bullseye. There's very little variation between the races in terms of default rates. There's almost no residual here. The banks are accurately assessing risk. I don't know exactly how many points being white is worth, but let's say it's 30. If it's 30, it would go something like this. A white person with a credit score of 670 gets a loan of 5% interest, but a black person, to get the same loan, would need a credit score of 700. And on aggregate, a black with a credit score of 700 will default as often as a white with a credit score of 670 for the same loan in principle. Again, I don't know if it's 30 points or 50 points or 20 points, but this is how it works in principle. And look, if you think the banks are leaving money on the table by doing this, if you think they're irrationally discriminating in a way that's not optimally responding to the lending market, well then by all means put your money where your mouth is and give loans in a race neutral fashion and carve into that margin and get some money for yourself. Not necessarily you in particular, ContraPoints. I don't think you have a lot of investing capital, but it's been 50 years since people knew this was happening. If there was money to be made on this margin, someone would have already done it. There was a congressional investigation on this in the 2000s, and the investigation concluded that banks were accurately assessing risk and that the credit score isn't a crystal ball. Race still matters.
What's happened is a sub-industry has emerged of shark lawyers who swoop in on the lead poisoning victims, some of whom can't even read a contract, and offer to buy out their structured monthly settlements in exchange for a lump sum that's a fraction of the total worth of the settlement. 4. Blockbusting. Predatory real estate agents often used a scheme known as blockbusting, where they'd intentionally provoke fear of an impending minority takeover among residents of a white neighborhood. They would then exploit the fear that they created to trick white homeowners into selling their houses at below market prices, so they could resell those same houses at extortionate prices to black families desperate to escape the ghetto.
I don't know what to do about this. Like, A fool and his money are soon parted. I don't know what your solution is for this. Do you want to have for every black person to have some sort of minder to tell them how to manage their finances? I don't know what your solution to this is supposed to be. One thing that ContraPoints does here that I see all the time among shitlibs is imagining that there are inherently bad neighborhoods. Now, while that idea is obviously just insane on its face, and you should just be able to say something like, there's literally no reason to believe that there are inherently bad neighborhoods, and it's obvious that a bad neighborhood is really just a black neighborhood, I think there are some ways we can show this more strongly. One thing we can look at are the hollowing out of what used to be good neighborhoods once the blacks moved in. They became ghettos. They became bad neighborhoods. Entire cities, Baltimore, Detroit, Atlanta, St. Louis, South Chicago, now known as Chicago or Shit Congo. Here's a starker way to put it. What happened to Baltimore is precisely what segregation was meant to stop. What happened to Detroit is what segregation was trying to stop. What happened to basically the inner city everywhere was what segregation policies in the past were trying to stop. And it was a failure to stop this that caused all of these once good neighborhoods to become Africanized. ContraPoints says he's not trying to make you believe in white guilt.
No, I don't have any white guilt. That's not what this is about. That's just more white narcissism is what that is. So wipe away those white ass tears. Here.
And then he turns around and says,
in this country's ongoing insistence on treating a problem of injustice as if it were simply a problem of criminality. I know I said my interest in this topic isn't a matter of white guilt, and it's not, but also, fellow whites, how do we sleep at night? In this guided meditation, you're going to relax your body and release your guilt. You're not responsible for what your great-grandparents did. As you ease the tension in each muscle group, exhale deeply and repeat the mantra. Black Lives Matter are the real racists.
Okay, so I'm not trying to say you should feel guilty for being white, but I'm just saying that white people are horrible and you benefit from that and you owe restitution to everyone else on the planet. Look, ContraPoints, you're just afraid of the term white guilt because you know it's true and you know using it is an effective way to snap people out of your moral bullying trance that you have. One thing that ContraPoints likes to do is say people of color.
But disproportionately, people of color are victimized by this system. Incarceration of people of color, and then you should go subscribe to a bunch of people of color and listen to what they have to say.
Now, people who use this term, people of color, are invariably an anti-white racist to some degree or another. First off, it's a falsehood. There's obviously more diversity of color among Europeans than there is among everyone else combined, who are just shades of brown, for whatever you think this matters. I think it's an implicit slur on whites. You lack color, you're stale, unlike the vibrant people of color, but whatever. But think about someone who uses the term Gentile a lot. Someone who says Gentile is probably anti-Jewish. He has a word for everyone else that Jews are excluded from. We should always keep in mind the historical context of all this. The world prior to the Industrial Revolution in Western Europe lived on about $500 to $700 a day. And almost all of what are classified as significant inventions, according to a set of over 100 scientific encyclopedias, almost all came after the year 1600. The scientific development prior to that was a little midget battle that didn't have hardly any impact on the standard of living of the people of that day, and there were retrogressions. Technology would be lost. There are absolutely no signs, no reason to believe that China or India, let alone anywhere else, was ever going to have an industrial revolution. So anything you have above $500, or let's say $700, or let's be generous, anything you have over $1,000 a year, you can thank white people. Now, if you want to learn more about this, you can look at my video, The European Revolution, and all of the sources therein. So when someone like ContraPoints talks about white guilt, which is precisely what he's doing, he's talking about some things white people did that potentially possibly caused some brown people to be lower within the range of between subsistence and the top 1% of the world. But the fact that any of them are within that range in the first place and not right at subsistence is because of white people.
1. Restrictive covenants. When the 1910 ordinance was overturned, Baltimore's mayor created an official Committee on Segregation, which cooperated with neighborhood associations to pressure landlords in white neighborhoods to sign covenants committing them never to sell or rent to black residents. These agreements were enforced through strategic building and health code citations issued against owners and by evictions of black renters who violated the covenant.
Now, ContraPoints just says this like this is some terrible evil, but this is literally what all countries do with outsiders, and none of these white people here ever agreed that blacks were their countrymen. There was no referendum, there was no plebiscite, there was no vote among whites in the US to make blacks their countrymen. Blacks were not citizens. So another thing to consider is that Detroit and Philadelphia, prior to general emancipation in 1865, the freed blacks in those cities were both legally and residentially integrated. In fact, prior to general emancipation, there was not a single majority black neighborhood in Detroit or Philadelphia. Those blacks were not segregated. These were the blacks who earned their freedom prior to the end of slavery, and so we can surmise that they were higher quality people than the general black population. Historians who write about the time, for whatever you think that's worth, certainly agree that these were much more white-presenting blacks. They were not particularly criminal, they were not any more criminal than the white population, and they were not any less industrious than the white population. And objectively, we know that the anti-black laws in northern cities didn't take off until general emancipation, until whites came into contact with not just the talented 10th blacks who earned their freedom prior to the end of slavery, but the average blacks who were not able to do so. And it was this experience that caused the whites to start to erect both legal and outright physical barriers between them and the blacks in the northern cities. The same thing happened in South Africa. Initially, blacks were not excluded from anything in South Africa. It was only after years of hard experience that the whites in South Africa enacted segregation laws to keep the blacks apart. It wasn't pre-Judice, it was post-Judice. We have another natural experiment on this. We have whites who have had long, regular contact with blacks in one part of the country, and white people who live far away from blacks. If anti-black sentiment was pre-Judice and not post-Judice, we would expect whites in the South to have a more positive view of blacks than whites in the North do. But you know that it's the opposite. Now, of course, ContraPoints is going to come in and say, well, you know, the reason that whites in the South have negative views of blacks is because of history of racism and oppression and slavery and institutional norms and blah, 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 blah. Right? All these sociological rabbit holes he'll go down to say that whites in the South have negative views of blacks because they have had negative views of blacks for a long time. That's basically what he's saying. And what's so disingenuous about this is that you just know that if whites in the South had more positive views of blacks than whites in the North did, people like ContraPoints would be jumping on that data straight away to say, see, those who have more contact with blacks actually have more positive views of them. But because it's the opposite, ContraPoints is going to spin you a tale about all the institutionalisms as to why whites in the South don't like blacks as much as whites in Maine do. And you even see this dynamic in the UK, where whites in England, which is further south, are more anti-immigrant than whites in Scotland are. This is because whites in England have more experience with African and South Asians than the Scots do, being closer to London and being where those people tend to be settled. Now, I know you try to interface with reality as little as possible, ContraPoints, so you almost certainly won't watch or listen to this video, but on the off chance that you do, could you, ContraPoints, tell me what view I'm supposed to have of black people? Now, I'm not asking for a platitudes. I'm not asking for any bullshit like, just treat all people with dignity. No, you tell me, based on their behavior, how I am supposed to evaluate this group. Should my evaluation be more like the white South Africans and the whites in the South who have long, hard experience with blacks? Or should my view of blacks be more like those of white people in Maine or Iceland?
No, I don't have any white guilt. That's not what this is about. That's just more white narcissism is what that is. So wipe away those white ass tears. Here, I'll pick you out a cotton ball.
Oh yeah, this shit. Look, I'm not letting these little bullshit jabs slide. Blacks in the US should be thanking their lucky stars for the Atlantic slave trade. Blacks in the Americas almost certainly would have been slaves within Africa if not for the Atlantic slave trade. And there's a few ways we can infer this. The first is that the slave trade within Africa was about 9 times that of the Atlantic slave trade at the time of the Atlantic slave trade. And approximately 40% of the population of Black Africa were slaves at the time. And this was true until the continent was taken over by Europe. Right? It was Europeans who stopped slavery within Africa. We also know this from the inelasticity of supply. Basically what this means is that an increase in the demand for slaves always resulted in a several order of magnitude increase in the price of slaves, which is evidence that the slave traders could not increase the supply of slaves in response to any increase in demand. Now, intuitively, this makes sense. Capturing people and selling them into slavery is a hard thing. It's not easy to just go out and say, I think I'll get more slaves because the price is higher. It was probably hard to become a slaver in the first place. It was dangerous and difficult to capture slaves, and slavers just got as many slaves as they could. It's not like building cars or growing corn. And so an increase in the number of buyers or the number of money willing to buy slaves was not going to increase the number of slaves produced. At least that's what the inelasticity of supply implies, and intuitively it makes sense that this would be the case. On top of that, black slaves, once in the US, they actually worked about 400 fewer hours per year than free white farmers did. We know this from how much a white person worked per year, and we know how much free white farmers produced in that time. Blacks are assumed to be equally productive per hour, and they produce less per white person per year. There was also a natural experiment that replicates this, done by Trevon Logan and his family, where they manually sewed and picked cotton without any mechanization, and the amount of cotton they produced on their little family farm was very close to that of historical yields during slavery. And today, even though blacks are actually slightly shorter than whites today, this is something a lot of people don't know, during slavery, blacks were actually slightly taller, which is evidence that they had better nutrition back then, or that they weren't required to work at as young an age as white children, or some combination of factors that made them taller than whites, even though, based on modern height, they're not genetically predisposed to being any taller than white people. Okay, let's go through the next thing. On the rape of black slaves, that's another slavery trope. Thaddeus Russell from A Renegade History of the United States says, quote, "Statistics further suggest that rapes were rare on plantations. Most of the mixed race in the South were either slaves who lived in cities where opportunities for interracial liaisons were far greater, or free. According to the 1860 census, 20% of urban slaves and 39% of free blacks in southern cities were mulattoes. But among rural slaves, which made up 95% of the slave population, only 9.9% were mulatto. Of the slave population as a whole, mulattoes made up only 7.7% in 1850 and 10.4% in 1860. Moreover, only 1.2% of the former slaves interviewed by the Works Progress Administration in the 1930s reported being raped by a master. Only 5.8% reported hearing about the rape of another slave, and only 4.5% said that one of their parents had been white. According to Fogel and Angerman from Time on the Cross, all of the available evidence taken together indicates that, quote, the share of Negro children fathered by whites on the slave plantations probably averaged between 1 and 2%. Even Fogel and Angerman's most hostile critics concede that it was no more than 8%. There's also evidence of a significant number of consensual relations between white men and slave women, which would make the percentage of children produced by rape even smaller. Also, a pinch test here. White men raping black women. This is something that literally almost never happens today. So it's a bit of a claim to say that it happened all the time in the past. White men are overwhelmingly not attracted to black women today, and there's no reason to assume that they would have been back then. And Thaddeus Russell didn't say this, but I will. 1 to 2% of black women saying they were raped by white men, all that means is 1 to 2% say that they were raped by white men. And if they were politically savvy, they would have a political reason to say that, even if it were not true. For the corporal punishment stuff, look, there's no data on that. We know of one guy who kept records on corporal punishment, Bennett H. Barrow, but you can't infer anything from that because unlike ContraPoints, I'm not a retard who bases his worldview on anecdotes. Intuitively, it seems unlikely that slave masters would try to create open wounds in their very expensive property in an era before antibiotics, where a cut could kill you. On top of that, black people in the US had a higher literacy rate immediately following slavery than did Russia. In 1870, Russia had a literacy rate of 15% compared to 20% for black Americans. And the continent of Africa didn't achieve a literacy rate of 20% until the 1950s. And lastly, ContraPoints needs some perspective. There were more black slaves sent to the Middle East than to the Americas. But the Arabs generally don't have this problem. The Arabs generally did not let their black slaves reproduce. They castrated the males. And today they don't have a problem with blacks. White people didn't have to free the slaves. They didn't have to keep them in the Americas, but they did. And because of this, ContraPoints is demanding the fucking sun and the moon from white people for this. Hypothetical, this is not a trick question. If black people didn't exist, if all those blacks were just sent back to Africa, would ContraPoints be demanding a whole bunch of stuff from white people to blacks? No, he would not. Right? And that is the moral hazard of what he's doing. That is why what he's doing is kind of gross. White people could have packed them all on boats, sent them back to Africa, and be done with this whole mess. What's unique about white people is not that they had slavery, but that they ended it. Not only in their own countries, but in every country they conquered. The idea white people should be ashamed. The rest of the world should be ashamed that it took being ruled by white people for them to end slavery. To hang slavery around the neck of the race that is solely responsible for ending it. Not only without the help of anyone else, but with the resistance of everyone else. That it had to be imposed upon them to end slavery, to hang it on the head of whites. You have to be a real evil son of a bitch to do that. So if you wish to have blood on your hands, ContraPoints, be my guest. Though my guess is that blood is from constantly reopening that open wound between your legs where your genitals used to be while pretending it's a vagina.
There's an endless mill of content about how authoritarian and evil Black Lives Matter is, and how it's identity politics equivalent to white nationalism.
Well, I guess this is another thing that we can agree on, because let's take a country. And within this country, you got two groups. One is trying to break off from the other and partition and form a new country. The other has all sorts of legal advantages and really doesn't want this. They get preferential treatment in universities. The government requires that you get a certain percentage of government jobs from these people. They have set-asides. And they can freely form their own exclusive communities and exclusive organizations. While the group that wants to break off is legally prohibited from creating their own spaces. The group that wants to stay currently gets $300 billion in net wealth transfers from the other group, the group that wants to leave, and is constantly militantly trying to use their influence on government to get even more, to regularly bully any white who speaks out about this as if he's some sort of heretic, that's medieval Europe, as an enemy of the revolution, Soviet Union, a suppressive, I don't know, that's Scientology. A communist anti-American, no, that's 1950s America. Racist, right, as a racist. So yes, it is crazy to compare the two, because white nationalism is inherently separatist and positive. It's about freeing one's own people from others, while black nationalism is inherently supremacist and negative. It's about extracting resources and rent-seeking from other races that their twisted ideology tells them is oppressing them, when in reality, white people gave them almost everything they have. People who are actually oppressed tend to have escape on their mind. They're not thinking about new ways of gaming the system to get more goodies that other people have to pay for. Like all these black marches. They get 260 points on the SAT for being black, but that's not enough. They want more. Because despite the privileges they get for university admissions, there's still a very small proportion of people at these universities. The truly oppressed don't think or act like this. The truly oppressed just want to get the hell out of whatever situation they're in. And that's what white nationalists are, and that's what white nationalists want. The truly oppressed want separation. You want to know who's oppressed, who wants separation. You want to know who's dominating and oppressing. Look who's trying to game the system. Look who's trying to get even more goodies than they already have. This is also why ContraPoints saying that you're left-wing. This is just loony. ContraPoints, you're fucking Saruman. You're as left-wing as Saruman. Is Saruman left-wing? Who knows? Right? Saruman was an orc supremacist and he hates men. You are a black supremacist, raging against your own kith and kin. It's great. I mean, I'm looking at you and like, you really are like something out of a Warhammer fantasy codex. Touched by Slanesh, your body mutilated by the gods of chaos, turning against civilization and the people responsible for the world as you know it. And, you know, go ahead and laugh at this kind of stuff, but that's an archetype. And look at you. You are that archetype. ContraPoints likes to blabber about other people interviewing Nazis, oh my god, a Nazi.
Or, you know, we could just keep doing live streams with Richard Spencer. Interviews with Nazis, the new YouTube craze. God damn it. Now, a lot of people are gonna look at the incarceration data and say, if the blacks don't like going to jail, they should just do less crimes. Let's do another interview with Richard Spencer. You know what? Why don't we all interview Richard Spencer? Every single YouTuber. Free speech mandates that we all constantly broadcast fascist propaganda. Let's get them all in here, every single Nazi in one giant live stream, and then we can finally give the Jewish question the platform it deserves. God damn it, where's my toad venom?
And this is you just not understanding the point of the internet. When you have a media environment where you can actually hear arguments out without it being chopped up and edited by addle-brained journalism majors, there's going to be a large market to hear new ideas that deal with reality. Now, there is certainly a market, as you are aware of, ContraPoints, to feed back shitlib narrative, and you make a certain amount of money doing so. You feed back the bad schools myth, the myth that redlining mattered, the myth of prejudice, the myth of race differences in lead exposure. You feed back slavery, which is a whole set of myths, and of course your trashy video where you deny divergent evolution in humans. But for now, there's also a market for people who point out that, you know, white people are responsible for the world as you know it, ended slavery, and benefited everyone on the planet. And these positive facts about white people make you livid, and you start screeching, Nazi, Nazi, KKK, because you are a spiteful little fungus of a man.
Заболела Дуниноголовка, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. А чего же она заболела, а чего же она заболела, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Из-под моря земли захотела, из-под моря земли захотела, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Я на коре море перееду, я на коре море перееду, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Из-под моря землицы достану, из-под моря землицы достану, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай. Мы полечим Дунину головку, мы полечим Дунину головку, мамашка моя благодетельница, а я дочка твоя разорительница. Вот те гребень, вот те лед, вот те 40 веретен, ты сиди попрядывай, на меня поглядывай.